Your hot station, number one for news and entertainment, which you're listening to this lovely Wednesday morning. As earlier announced, we are going to have a conversation with Dr. Sishuwa on the current governance and human rights situation in Zambia. Dr. Sishuwa is joining us on the phone this morning. Dr. Sishuwa, good morning and welcome to the Red Hot Breakfast.
Good morning, Peter. Good morning.
It's good to have you on the show this morning. I want us to begin here. The Hichilema presidency is now almost reaching mid-term. What's your overall assessment of its performance, especially in the area of good governance and human rights?
Thank you. Well, good governance is a contested concept, as you know, but from a human rights perspective, it refers primarily to how public institutions conduct their affairs and guarantee the realization of human rights. And one can assess the conduct of public institutions by looking at such areas like as democratic institutions, the anti-corruption, the respect for the rule of law. So when one assesses the performance of the presidents on these indicators, the result is quite disappointing. Let me briefly talk about each of these very, very, very quickly. On democratic institutions, Peter, I had expected the Hichilema administration to do better in relation to the promotion of civil and political rights, but the continued banning of opposition rallies, on what they concerns and lack of adequate manpower has been particularly disappointing and hard to take. Not only does this show the abuse of the Public Order Act, it also demonstrates total disregard for the rights of peaceful assembly, free speech since people meet to talk, and even freedom of association. These are the very violations that we condemned under PF and which Hichilema himself suffered when he was in opposition. The president is, of course, fortunate this time that the key institution that can hold him to account, that is civil society and the Western actors, are now compromised for different reasons. But what he and his administration are doing is wrong, because opposition parties, Peter, play an important role in competitive multi-party democracies. Their views on different issues of public interest can benefit those in power when they are receptive to criticism. So I don't understand, the government's determination to prevent opposition rallies, because curtailing the work of opposition as they are doing, harms the UPND's democratic credentials. It also deprives us, you and I as voters, of the opportunity to listen to alternative views and decide on the basis of what we would have heard, if to support the opposition or the party in power. Because if opposition parties think they can do a better job than the governing party, let the voter have the chance to listen to their messages or policy appeals. And then secondly, I've been disappointed by the failure to reflect adequate ethnic diversity in public appointment, which has not only undermined the constitutional requirement of equality of opportunities, but also fed growing public perception that Hichilema appears to see himself primarily as the leader of Zambians from one half of the country, mainly where the UPND has been doing very well electorally. The quiet but ongoing marginalization of Zambians, including civil servants who trace their ethnic origins from the other half of the country, has not helped the situation. As you know, Peter, the Lungu presidents marginalized people from southern, western, and northwestern provinces that voted for HH and promoted those from areas of support such as eastern and the Bemba-speaking provinces. Hichilema promised to do things differently if elected, but in power, he has largely reversed the old pattern, though, of course, he has done comparatively better if Lungu is the yardstick, for example. Now, when you look at the top leadership positions of the key ministries such as finance, defense, education, health, local government, justice, land, labor, foreign affairs, and information and broadcasting, they are all held by individuals from one half of the country. And the same pattern emerges when you look at the top leadership position of the defense and security services, the Zambia Army, Zambia National Service, Zambia Police, Zambia Air Force, the Zambia Security and Intelligence Services, are all occupied by individuals from one half of the country. The top leadership position of the justice system, the Attorney General, the Solicitor General, the Chief Justice, the President of the Constitutional Court, and the heads of the Judicial Service Commission and Judicial Competence Commission are held by individuals from one half of the country. The top leadership positions of the National Assembly, the Executive, the Electoral Commission of Zambia, the main diplomatic mission stations such as China, Brazil, UK, South Africa, Canada, the US, it's the same thing. The statutory bodies and state-owned enterprises like Zanaco, IDC, ZESCO, Zambia Development Agency, ZISKI, ZICTA, the HCM Investment Holding, the National Council of Construction, you look at that and say, oh, this is what Lungu was doing, but what HH is doing is basically the reverse of what is happening now. What I don't understand, is why HH and the UPND are refusing to learn from history, because this is a very ethnic regional division that many of us condemned under Lungu, because we saw the practice as a violation of Zambia's national values and principles, like non-discrimination, national unity and equality as stipulated in Article 8 of the Constitution. So it's therefore hard to understand why HH thinks that the very thing that we condemned under Lungu is now acceptable because it is him at the helm of the presidency. Very briefly, in the area of anti-corruption, again, the situation is not encouraging there either. To this day, HH has refused to publish the value of his assets and liabilities, despite being elected on a platform of accountability and transparency. That's a violation of Zambia's constitution that requires morality and ethics from public leaders as part of the national values and principles. The reluctance by HH, to disclose his assets undermines the fight against corruption and the need for government transparency. You can't fight corruption against former officials in the PF if you yourself are not leading by example. And it has added suspicion, Peter, about the extent of the president's involvement in Zambia's economy and whether his policies are deliberately designed to benefit companies in which he has an interest. We have also seen very poor record when it comes to fighting corruption in his own government. The fight against the corruption of the PF officials, is commendable. But he has shown an unwillingness to deal with high-level corruption in his own government, especially in the areas of public procurement. It's as if his strategy involves hiding corruption, because Hichilema knows voters despise graft, which is a key reason why Edgar Lungu and the PF were ejected from power. But so he appears determined to prevent not so much the corruption itself, but the perception of it, which might help explain why he removed the former Auditor General and appointed a potentially pliant one who does not even constitutionally qualify to hold that office, so that he may be beholden to the appointing authority and help cover the HM administration's corruption tracks. And the continued interference, I must add briefly, Peter, by State House officials in the fight against corruption, particularly in matters involving very senior government officials and close business associates of the president, has also undermined the fight against corruption, even when the ACC itself is led by a very competent board.
Dr. Sishuwa.
Because what has largely determined
Dr. Sishuwa, can you hear me? Doc, let's continue our conversation regarding this issue to do with the human rights situation in Zambia and governance, as well as good governance. You were one of the millions of Zambians that supported the UPND in the run-up to the 2021 elections. What would you say have been the most What would you say have been the most disappointing? What has disappointed you the most with this administration?
Thanks, Peter. First, it's not correct to say I supported the UPND. I opposed the wrongs of the PF and Lungu, which people interpreted as a sign of support for the opposition. I would say that, successive ruling parties and their supporters failed to realize my simple approach to public commentaries. I hold to account elected public leaders who are in office at a given time, whoever these may be. Once they exit office, my attention shifts to the failings of the new leaders. And that often makes me appear like I'm working with the opposition. So as a result, successive presidents and their supporters tend to mistake me for an opposition supporter, when all I do is to share my opinions on matters of governance as I'm with you now. So I thought I should just get that out of the way.
Okay.
As to the question of what has disappointed me the most from this administration, well, I would say to the lack of structural reforms, especially those that would strengthen accountable governance and safeguard the independence of democratic institutions. Three areas are worth highlighting here very briefly. The first is the failure to create a transparent and more inclusive mechanism of appointing judges and the officers of the Electoral Commission of Zambia. You remember that in opposition, Hichilema promised a departure from the Lungu era appointment of judges and ECZ commissioners, devoid of public participation and vetting. In office, he reneged on these pledges and done precisely what he once opposed when he was outside power. Instead of putting in place legislation that would increase transparency and public participation in the appointment ECZ commissioners and judges. He has simply replaced Lungu's choices at the Electoral Commission with his own, and he has hired about 20 or so judges, including the Constitutional Court, which are the final say on electoral issues. The second is the delay in repealing legislation that undermines democracy, such as the Public Order Act, the Cybersecurity and Cybercrimes Act, and even the relevant provisions of the Penal Code, such as those dealing with criminal libel. And that is symptomatic, Peter, of the administration's lack of willingness to make structural changes that would strengthen accountable governance. Because what you see now is that democratic institutions remain as susceptible to manipulation by the executive as they were under the PF and Lungu. Because while in opposition, HH, he promised wide democratic reform, but in power, he has recognized the advantage of leaving laws that restrict the activities of the opposition in place. And the final point I would say, I think, is in the reluctance to fast-track the enactment of new legislation, such as the access to information law that would enhance transparency and assist the media and civil society in fighting corruption. Such a law, as you know, Peter, has been promised by successive main opposition parties who have then dragged their feet once in government. HH's administration has now joined them. In over 2 years now, his administration has not even got as far as producing a draft bill, despite earlier talk that this legislation will be ready last June.
Okay. In 2026, the UPND will be bidding for re-election. Vice President Mutale Lumango is quoted as saying the party will rule for another 50 years. What do you make of such a statement?
I was very disappointed, when I read that statement from the Vice President. It suggests two things. The first is, and at this basic level in terms of understanding, it demonstrates the arrogance of power by those who are briefly entrusted to exercise it on behalf of the owners, the public, that is, the people. And secondly, it speaks to the growing confidence among UPND officials, having secured the backing of Western countries, further weakened civil society, and packed the courts, the ECZ, the civil service, the police, and other critical public institutions with their supporters. They now think they're in a position where they can even dream to be in power beyond their lifetime. I do have faith, Peter, in the Zambian people. I always remember the argument that Kaunda could not be dislodged from power because he had total control of the civil service, the police, the army, you name it. But in the end, that did not help him. Was he defeated by the military? No. Was he removed violently? No. He was defeated by the people through the power of the ballot. Zambians have shown, Peter, that when the country's future or interests is at stake, they can break boundaries and unite to secure it. That is the Zambian spirit, our ability to come together when the moment demands and help save not just the country but our collective interests. So the Vice President and the UPND must be told that they are not as invisible as they imagine. The people will win in the end because they always do. People can defeat Narumango and her UPND team and together with their international praise singers who are busy misleading our president with opportunistic praises that can only be tolerated by genuinely ignorant leaders with a deep-seated inferiority complex.
Doc, an activist with close ties to the UPND has petitioned the Constitutional Court to pronounce itself again on the eligibility of Edgar Lungu to contest the 2021 elections. What do you think the likely implications of such a petition?
I think to just give a bit of context here, I see the court action as part of the UPND's wider re-election strategy that I discussed in an article earlier this year. In June, I think it was titled "The President's 5-Point Plan to Stay in Power at All Costs." In that article, Peter, I warned that Hichilema's re-election was predicated on containing the influence of the Catholic Church, co-opting influential elites from civil society, capturing the Electoral Commission of Zambia and packing the courts, covering corruption tracks, and weakening the opposition, mainly the PF and the Socialist Party. So the court action that we witnessed is part of weakening the opposition. The objective of that court action, in my view, is to secure a favorable judgment that would disqualify Lungu from running in the 2026 election. Now, Peter, like many Zambians, I don't support Lungu, but I respect his democratic right to stand for elective office if he wishes to do so. What made Lungu eligible to stand in the 2021 election was a questionable decision of the Constitutional Court. That is what makes him eligible to stand in another election if it is held tomorrow in 2026. So since that judgment was passed, nothing has changed in the material circumstances, and unless that judgment is vacated, it is precedent, and all of us, including myself who sued Lungu in the 2021 case, are bound by it. After all, there are no limits to how many times a losing candidate may stand for election, as Hichilema himself proved when he was in opposition. Now, the UPND is fearful of Lungu's political comeback and its potential to undermine HH's re-election bid. And that is why you see this court action now, because afraid of that possibility, they devised this strategy at a 3-steps level. The first step was the appointment of judges to the Constitutional Court to beef up the numbers in favor of the UPND. And in April this year, Peter, we saw President Hichilema fulfilling that step by appointing 4 new judges to the Constitutional Court. The second step was to prepare the minds of Zambians that the previous ruling in the eligibility case of Edgar Lungu was not final, and that was possible to have a new challenge that could overturn the decision and consequently disqualify Lungu from standing. And in September this year, we saw the Minister of Justice, Mulambo Haimbe, fulfilling that step by telling news diggers that, and I think I'm quoting him here correctly, he says, I'm sure sooner than later you will hear of us, citizens and Zambians, asking for a decisive answer to that question. Because in the arrogance of numbers, Lungu did decide to be on the ballot. That in itself does not mean that was the correct decision. That's what Haimbe said. Now, the third step was to find a petitioner who would step forward to approach the Constitutional Court, seeking to disqualify Lungu from standing in 2026. That latest court action you have seen is a confirmation of what Haimbe said last month, that we are going to find somebody who's going to make this petition. And it shows the linkages of that court action to the UPND. I should finally end by saying there are currently 11 judges on the Constitutional Court. For the UPND to secure a favorable outcome, they need 6 judges to deliver a verdict that Haimbe calls the correct one. If you remember, in 2021, 9 judges, which were the full bench at the time, sat to determine the Lungu eligibility case. Of those 9, all of whom were appointed by the former president, 8 ruled that Lungu was eligible, while Justice Munalula dissented. Of the 8 who ruled, 1 has died and another has retired, bringing the current total number of judges, I think, in favor of Lungu to about 6. Those who ruled in favor of Lungu, about 6. This year, as I said, HH appointed 4 new judges to the Constitutional Court. I think it was Kenneth Mulife, Madford Mwendenga, Arnold Chilimi, and Maria Kawimbe. Now, going by Haimbe's logic on the arrogance of numbers, these 4 are expected to rule in UPND's favor. They are likely to be joined by Justice Munalula, bringing the total number of judges who may be seen as aligned to the UPND to 5. Now, to overturn the 2021 judgment, the full bench will have to sit, and 2 of the remaining 6 judges who had ruled in favor of Lungu in 2021, that is Anis Tali, Mungeni Mulenga, Palani Mulonda, Matthew Msaruke, Matthew Chisunka, and Judy Mulongot, they will have to abandon their 2021 positions and flip. That is if all those appointed by HH will rule in effectively his interest. The problem here, Peter, is that if the judges reverse that indeed defective 2021 ruling by disqualifying Lungu, such a decision would confirm that the new judges on the Constitutional Court bench are there to serve the interest of the executive. A pro-UPND verdict would also completely damage whatever is left of the court's credibility, because how can the same judges who have previously ruled on 3 occasions that Lungu was eligible to stand turn around after the election of a new president to claim that, in fact, he was not eligible when the law on which they based their previous decisions has not changed? But even if the UPND loses this case, Peter, I expect them to seek to disqualify Lungu by coming up with a constitutional amendment bill that would straighten, so to speak, presidential term limits, because they seem to be occupied by this phobia of Lungu. Lungu matters. Even if he stood, I don't think he could win. But the UPND are so afraid of Lungu that they won't rest until the former president is barred by law from standing. And the other person, of course, that they're afraid of is and determined to disqualify the Socialist Party leader. But that is a subject for another day.
As we conclude, Doc, how do you think the UPND could start redeeming itself in the remaining few years before 2026 elections?
Well, I think for me they should address what I would say the major weaknesses that may lead to HH loss of power in 2026 if it doesn't change. I'll highlight 4 of these, for example, very quickly. The first is the bad influence of external actors, largely extractive and oblivious to the domestic context, on his leadership and key developments in the country. When you talk to black people who work closely with Hichilema, they say the president is largely unreceptive to advice unless it comes from some people far away in North America and Europe, or their overseas representatives in Zambia, and a particular few in South Africa. the president should wake up and realize that for many Western actors and their agents, liberal democracy is simply the entry point for securing their vital and strategic interests. Let him pay attention to the domestic concerns of Zambia and the people who put him in office. That's one. Two, I think what he should do is to tackle high-level corruption, especially in his administration, and stop this continued interference, by his officials in the fight against corruption. I hear people sometimes comparing HH to Mwanawasa. You can't compare those two. Mwanawasa was very decisive in dealing with corruption, including corruption of his officials. You can only compare Mwanawasa to HH if you are contrasting the two. So I hope that the president can really come out and declare, tell us what the value of his assets is, and be serious for once in fighting corruption. The third one is
Doc,
I'd
like to ask you one question on that issue to do with declaring his assets, because the PF had changed the laws as far as declaration is concerned. So the discretion is on him to actually declare to the nation. He's not compelled, is he?
I didn't use the word declare. I'm very careful in my choice of word. I said publish or publicize, for example. I don't know about the change in the law because see, when they were challenged, when Cornelius Mweta was challenged by people to name the law that was changed, he hasn't done so. So I don't know about that. But assuming that it was changed, what stops Hichilema out of the morality and ethic requirement of that is stipulated in Article 8 of the Constitution from saying, here is what I declared the Electoral Commission of Zambia. He's not changing anything. He's just telling Zambians, I own shares in these and these companies. So if you see these companies competing for public tenders, for example, we can know that the president has a vested interest there, and we can then decide whether those companies have received a favorable treatment. Why is he so keen to hide what he declares to the Electoral Commission of Zambia, if at all is transparent? Now, I was ending up with the point that the other thing that where I should focus his attention is on the cost of living crisis and the dire youth unemployment. Peter, people are suffering. You see, when we talk about these things, people will just stand up and say, "Oh, who are you? Representing? Everything is okay in this country. You just don't know what you are talking about." Peter, I have relatives in these compounds in Kanyama, for example. When you talk about the delivery of services like food and jobs, I must say poor Zambians are particularly estranged from Hichilema's government and its elitist, insensitive and out of touch approach to leadership. One that prioritizes the needs of foreigners, the rich and the educated. Because when you take the recent elimination of poor people from the street as an example, it brings tears to my eyes. I don't think we have really understood how the removal of street vendors has adversely affected so many other sub-economic activities that are connected to the poor source of livelihood. A driver and conductor are now out of jobs because there is no one to transport their vending places and no goods to transport. The Lebanese retailers of Salaula, who used to open 7 days a week, servicing orders for vendors, are now closed on Saturday and Sundays. The wheelbarrow transporters have packed their wheelbarrow because they have no goods to transport. The Chilimba safety net and money access between groups have collapsed in part because it has committed economic genocide against the poor by killing the sites of potent economic for these impoverished Zambians. Landlords are evicting people every day. Crime is on the increase. And does anyone care? When you listen to the language of our colleagues in government, they are so insensitive and out of touch with the plight of these people. So if the UPN really want to change, let them tackle the cost of living crisis. Let them tackle the youth unemployment because it's acute. It's not just people who are looking for jobs in teaching and education sectors. Finally, I would say that the final point they should say is let them manage this issue of ethnic and regional tribalism. It's very big. People are not happy about that. I'm speaking out against this thing because I spoke against it even under Lungu and the PF. I defended the rights of Tongas, Lozis, and Northwesterners to have a fair share of opportunities in the public service and in public appointments. I have the right, I think, to make the same call to say, don't marginalize Easterners, don't marginalize Bembas just because you are now in power. You are reversing what was happening under Lungu. That is as wrong now as it was wrong under Edgar. And the failure for me to reflect adequate ethnic diversity in public appointment, which has fed growing public perception that Hichilema appears to see himself primarily as the leader of Zambia from one half of the country. That's wrong. That should stop. And if it doesn't stop, What happened to Lungu might happen to HH in 2026.
Doc, I'd like to thank you very much for speaking to us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me, Pete.
All right, there you have it. That is Dr. Sishuwa just giving us his take on the current governance and human rights situation in Zambia. We're having a conversation with him right here on your hot station number one for news and entertainment. Keep it locked right here on 87.7.